Hello and welcome to the Reach Out for Mental Health podcast. I'm Stu Whiffin. Joining me always, Kirsty Eaton. Hello.
Hello, good morning.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm excited. A little bit nervous, but yeah, excited.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I imagine that you're excited and nervous because we have a guest today, Alastair Campbell. Good morning.
How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm all right.
We're awfully polite, aren't we?
I was so polite. You two got very similar accents, haven't you?
Yeah,
that'd be Essex.
that's going to be Grays. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did I not
Is it-
sound like this when I was on OC Island where we met Alistair? Was I
well,
speaking a bit more proper?
no, I don't think you were. No, I guess because I was in Essex, OC Island's part of Essex.
Mm.
I guess it felt in context. But now you're sitting in a kitchen somewhere with a clock, and it's just the fact that you both got very, very similar voices,
Yeah.
which is quite rare when you meet when you meet two people together. They usually got different accents.
Well, without getting too political,
Go on.
we're both from Thurrock, and Thurrock
Yeah,
Council
exactly.
is very much in the news right now, and for some very interesting deals made
Controversial
by
reason.
our Conservative council, and it's left us skint. We've got no money.
So what are they doing?
Well, our council's bankrupt.
Right.
Because there was an episode of Panorama last week about it, and there was some investments around £1 billion made into renewable energy, and the company folded quite quickly. And these meetings were being undertaken in places that didn't really feel like they were council based places to have these meetings. There was lots of very, very nice swanky hotels, and I don't know how it works, but I presume when you're using £1 billion worth of taxpayers' money, that it would have to get green lighted by multiple channels to get that over the line. But I don't know what happened, but it all got spent and it all disappeared, and yeah, we're now bankrupt. We're going to have a bankrupt council, which is rubbish, because there's going to be lots of people that need that council money, lots of vulnerable people that are now high and dry. And so, yeah.
Well, I don't know anything about politics, so I don't really have anything to say about it. Other than never vote Tory.
I mean, that's
Yeah, go on, Steve.
No, you're in a safe space to say that. I don't think you're going to get anybody disagreeing with you here. Well, look, we always start this podcast not with a rant about our local council. We normally start the podcast, Alastair, by asking our guests, if I say the words mental health to you, what comes to mind? Where does your mind go?
All over the place. Where does it go? I think the first thing I think of, well, I think it does depend how I'm feeling. So at the moment, I'm feeling kind of reasonably okay. And so I think it probably goes straight to a place of campaigning. I probably think mental health, we still haven't cracked it. And the campaign to try to destigmatize, change the dialogue, improve services, I sort of feel it's going backwards. If I was feeling very, very low, for example, and you said mental health, I'd probably think, shit. So I think it depends on how I'm feeling. But right now, today, when you said mental health, I was probably thinking campaign.
Can I ask, what does it you mean by we're going backwards?
Well, I just feel that I feel we're going forwards, or we're in a much better place in terms of general understanding. But I feel on services that we're going backwards. I think that if you or I today we're sitting here and the phone goes and it's a friend who says, "Oh, my daughter this, or my son this, or my brother this, and my sister that," and I don't know what to do, and they had some kind of mental health challenge, I think it's really hard to get them the support they need. So whereas I even worry that this is probably, I don't know if this is a helpful thing to say or not, but I even sometimes worry, you know what, we've done such an effective job of campaigning about awareness that now we've sort of made all these people realize that they might actually have not just a struggle but an illness, and they can't get help for it.
Interesting. Yeah, quite possibly. I think I mean, obviously COVID and the lockdowns had a massive impact on people's mental health. I mean, I think it's fair to say that nearly everybody was touched by some sense of anxiety or depression during those lockdowns and during the COVID period. And I thought that was a good thing because it kind of acted as a bit of a leveler. It sort of for those that were a bit intolerant or didn't really understand about just living with some sense of anxiety, perhaps, living in a lockdown gave people a bit more of an understanding and hopefully a bit more compassion towards others who may have been living with anxiety for a lot longer. But then, like you say, people are now aware of some of the struggles that they're experiencing. They've got a better understanding of it might be more serious than what they originally thought, rather than, oh, I'm just going through a bit of a shit time. It might be something more substantial. They're going to seek help. Services aren't prepared or have got the infrastructure to deal with that. And then those that have always been with mental health services for decades maybe are now being pushed to the back because us newbies are all coming to the fore saying, I've got a mental health problem, I'm not coping. And yeah, mental health services are just screwed, sadly.
Yeah, and that's why I actually think that, I mean, look, Thurrock Council, never vote Tory apart. I actually think that there is an expectation, and I certainly hope there'll be a change in government relatively soon. But even that, it's not enough. And I actually think that the more I sort of look into this, the more I think that we actually do have to do an awful lot more in terms of changing attitudes, because I just don't think we're going to get the services for quite a long time. And therefore, we've all of us got to think, well, how do we stop people becoming mentally ill? And that's actually, I think, a better challenge in many ways. And I think that's about how we treat kids. I think it's about schools. I think it's about the workplace. I think there's so much can be done that isn't just about sitting there shouting at government and saying, give us more money, give us more doctors, give us more nurses. Actually, how do we help ourselves and help each other not to get ill?
Really interesting point. What are your thoughts on that? Go a little bit deeper.
Well, it's funny as you take a sip of water there. So I think the reason I think I'm thinking more like that is because a few years ago now, I made a documentary for the BBC about depression. And it was called, I think it was called Me and My Depression. And the original idea of the BBC was that I would go around the world, talk to different people about depression, scientists, doctors, medics, patients, people, and then at the end of it, I would find a therapy or a form of treatment or a drug that I didn't know about, and I'd have a eureka moment, and then I'd go, wow, and I'd throw my sertraline antidepressants in the bin, and I'd walk into the sunset, and my life would be happy ever after. And I said, well, look, I don't honestly think that's very, very realistic. However, I do think it's an interesting idea to go around the world and sort of talk to people about different ways of thinking about depression. And I went to Canada to talk to a woman called Janine Austin. And the reason I was talking to her is she's a geneticist. She specializes in genetics. And the question I was asking her was whether there's any genetic element to mental ill health, right? Turns out the answer is not really. It's much more, if you've got two alcoholic parents, the chances are that you might lean in towards alcoholism, but it's not because of the genes, it's because of the upbringing.
Your environment rather than
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that was that. But we talked about it. It was interesting. It was an important part of the film. But then she said, how do you she said to me, deal with your depression? She said, I'm particularly interested because I get depression. And the thing was, it was like, wow, because I'm normally very, very good at spotting other people with depression. But with her, I had no sense of it at all. She was vibrant, energetic. She, you know, I'd have said that is a happy person, right? And anyway, so we talked a bit about that. So I said, well, you know, I take drugs every day and I see a psychiatrist and I'm not very well. Okay. What are you? She said, I'll get you this. She said, I've got a jam jar. I said, oh yeah, what does your jam jar do? She said, well, my jam jar is my little tool that I use to deal with my depression. So she taught me through it. And, you know, it was interesting, but I didn't really understand what she was talking about until I'm a great ruminator and I often wake up in the middle of the night and I go, oh yeah, get it. And I had one of those moments about back in London a few days later. I went, oh yeah, I get it. So this is now my jam jar. So right, I'll take a bit of water because there's too much water in this one. So down the bottom is what she called the sediment. In the jam jar, you've always got sediment. And there's nothing you can do about the sediment. It's always going to be there because that's your genes. And where you came from, who your parents were, nothing you can do. The rest of your jam jar is your life. And your life fills up with literally billions of experiences, billions of thoughts, billions of stuff that goes on. And most of it goes in, goes out because we don't remember it. Most of the stuff, you know, if I were to quiz you now on what you did minute by minute yesterday, 95% of it you've forgotten. So that goes. But what stays in is kind of heavy stuff, good stuff and bad stuff. You know, your first serious relationship, exams, driving tests, fights, accidents, you know, big bad stuff stays in there, good and bad. And she says, what happens is that most of the time we're kind of managing, we're just about coping, right? But then every now and again, we're not coping, it explodes. And that's when you get ill. And she said, instead of trying to undo everything, Freudians down here in the genes, psychologists in here with what you did last week, we should try and grow the jam jar. And like I say, when she first said it, I didn't really understand it, but over the week, I worked it out. So my jam jar goes as follows. FFF means, and basically she says, add to the jam jar, then you can put more life in. FFF is Fiona, family, friends. Fiona, my partner. Kit, if she and I are getting on, I've got more jam jar. If my kids are happy, and you know the old saying, you're never as happy as your least happy child. You're never more happy than your least happy child, 100%. So work, you know, help them if they're not happy. And it's hard. Friendship, you know, how many real friends have you got? Not that many, let's be honest, but those you have got, make sure they're close. So FFF. Next up for me is MA, meaningful activity. That means meaningful activity, I want to make a good living. But just as important, more important actually, meaningful activity, I want to make a difference. So whether it's mental health campaigning, whether it's going into schools and talking to kids about activism, whatever it might be, I feel I have to do that as well. Then I'm into what I call so that's it. They're the fundamentals. That's the foundation of my jam jar support system. And then it's into things like diet, which I never used to take seriously, sleep, which I never used to take seriously, exercise, which I never used to take seriously. Now I'm kind of a bit fanatical about all three. Then it's into the stuff that matters to you as an individual. So for me, bagpipe music, Burnley Football Club, my bike. It's weird that they all begin with B. Brexit. And then I'm into my thematic stuff. Curiosity. Never go to bed without knowing something you didn't know when you woke up. Creativity. I write every single day. Something. Music. I listen to music. I write music with my bagpipes. I've got a very musical mind. If I'm out and about in the car, chances are 70% chance I'm listening to music, not the news. And so it goes on. And then what I realized once I devised this, I went, oh yeah, medication. So the medication, which was number one,
it's now an afterthought.
Suddenly is up there. And I still take it. Now, here's the thing. It might be a complete coincidence. And the truth is that as a result of doing the documentary, I wrote a book, Living Better. As a result, now, I don't know whether it's as a result of, but since then, although I've still had, bad depression from time to time, I've had it a lot less. And it might be because I'm older, it might be because I'm leading a different sort of life. I don't know. But I'm even at the point, I don't think I'll do it. I'm even at the point of thinking, I wonder if I should try and come off the medication. So that's what I mean by, now, as a result, I have been, as a patient, costing the health service less than I did. Because I've worked out this is helping me. And then I now, since doing the film and doing the book, I've gone into schools, I've gone into businesses, and talked about the jam jar, and they now have their own jam jar. As a business, we'll say, right, what's our jam jar? And they'll talk about things like proper well-being support. Are we taking care of our staff properly? And so that's what I mean about trying to change the lens really through which we look at it. Because if it's just about illness, I'm not saying that's not important, it's incredibly important. But if we only think about mental health, this goes back to Stu's first question, if we only think about mental health as mental illness, which is kind of, I think, where we are at the moment.
We need to flip the script. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't think about mental health, we think about mental illness.
When you feel the onset of depression, and thankfully you said it's less these days, when you can feel that starting to creep up on you, have you got things that you do to try and work with it to better it?
Oh yeah. And again, the jam jar is one of them. I mean, I'm in France at the moment, but on my desk at home is literally a jam jar. It's in fact, it's a French jam jar, La Bonne Maman, the good mother, that sort of red and white, you might have seen it, the red and white check top. And what I do is I go and I just sit and hold it and I take the lid off. And I go like, okay, you're feeling shit. First thing I tell myself is I've been here before. I've got through this before, so I can do it again. And then I say, right, FFF. Even though I'm not feeling like it, I've got to try and be nice to Fiona. Phone the kids. Is there a friend I haven't spoken to for a while? Maybe phone them up and say I'm feeling shit. They won't mind. Meaningful activity. Right.
Keep bagpipes out.
Well, that would be the music thing.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. No, the meaningful activity would be, I got that bid the other day to go and do an event in Germany in 3 weeks' time. I'm in two minds about whether to do it. Say yes. Do it. And then write something. What are you going to write? Don't know. Write something. Just write something. Maybe you had another thing. School asked you to go and talk to them. Okay, do it. And then the other thing, diet. Watch what you're eating. Don't drink. Sleep. Feel tired? Have a nap. Exercise. You don't feel like going out, and often I don't want to be depressed. I'm sure a lot of people can identify that. You don't want to go out. I'll walk up and down the stairs 10 times. And so that's exercise. So that's some. Now listen, I'm giving you a very positive portrayal of how I use it. Sometimes I just can't. But I do find that incredibly useful, and also music. Honestly, if people would just understand the kind of healing power. Sometimes making you cry. Sometimes just the fact that you can
release.
Just play a piece of music and then cry and feel better. So these are all things that I do and I bring in, and it doesn't always work, but often does.
I think things like music and that. Do you think that's the healing qualities in music, I totally agree with what you say there. But do you think it's also a distraction to take your mind away from it and to get immersed in something else?
Yeah. Or actually, yes, but it might be that you're getting immersed in the same thing, but you're giving it a kind of purpose and a shape. I often find, for example, if I'm, in fact, I did this recently, I was feeling very low recently, and I went out on the bike, cycle quite a lot when I'm in France. And I went out on the bike and I listened. I know you shouldn't, but I was listening to really, really, really sad music. Jack Brel, and I was picking songs which I knew were going to kind of set me off. And so I'm out on the bike and I'm cycling away, and suddenly I'm crying as I'm riding the bike. I'm not crying about anything in particular. I've made myself cry because I've had the experience in the past of that sometimes can lead you to feeling a bit better and your head starts to clear a little bit. Not
Yeah,
always.
it is. It's that release, isn't it? It's almost like a cleanse, the
Yeah.
whole cathartic process of crying,
Yeah.
regardless of what it might be about. It might be completely misdirected, but
Totally.
just the act of crying, definitely.
Yeah.
I have a music podcast, and I ask guests about their approach to if they've woke up and they're feeling a little blue. What is your go-to? Do you go, right, I'm feeling shit, I'm gonna go and listen to Wham and just throw myself around the front room and listen to pure joyous pop music? The amount of people that will go, oh God, no, I'm reaching for Leonard Cohen, I'm listening to Nick Cave, and I am going to immerse myself in it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. What you said there, Alastair, I completely agree with. I think there's something that you should use these, beautiful things like music and film to almost, give that mood you're in a bit of a cuddle and, immerse yourself in it and to soundtrack it and to find that beauty in that soundtrack. I think it's a really positive thing.
I mean, it's funny, as you were talking there, I don't know if you can see, but my fingers started moving. And the reason was I was playing a lament on the back on my fingers on the bagpipes. So you were talking there, and I was starting to play this really dark, slow, and it's a song about death. So that's, I have different go-to places. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it will be like the other day, Jack Brel, who's like a kind of, he's basically a singing poet. He is kind of Leonard, more towards the Leonard Cohen end of things. But then, that particular day, I listened to him for about an hour. I stopped at a cafe, and then I put on this. I listened to a lot of German stuff, and German, basically Europop, Schlager. These sort of German old-fashioned hit music with. It's not quite Umbaba, but it's like
It's not Rammstein either. So.
No, it's not. It's modern. It's modern. If you want to look up, you want to look them up. Something like Helena Fischer, Vanessa May, these Vanessa Mai, sorry, M-A-I, not M-A-E, and these are just like modern German hit songs, and they're not Wham, but if you would bounce around your sitting room. I don't really bounce around sitting rooms, but especially not when I'm on a bike.
Alastair, can I sort of dig a little bit deeper into your life and mental health? Like, can you sort of take us back to the time when you maybe for the first time started to kind of think, I'm not feeling maybe as well as I should be?
I don't really know when that would be. The first time I was really aware of mental illness was when my brother was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And that was a massive, massive moment for all of us.
How old was you then?
I would have been between school and 18. So he was in his early 20s. He was in the army. And that was a massive thing for me. And I actually went and stayed with him. He was in a military hospital down in Hampshire. And I stayed with him down there. I went down with my dad. My dad had to go back to work. I stayed down. I was drinking really, really heavily. I think I was conscious of having a drink problem quite early. But feeling bad, I don't really know. Because I think I was in denial of it all for a long, long time. So I only really was thinking, God, I'm not well, when I had a breakdown and ended up in hospital.
I read a little bit about that. Was that when you was working with Neil Kinnock? And
I wasn't working with him, but I was spending a day with him, and I was up in Scotland with him.
Okay.
Yeah. And I had this kind of it was psychotic breakdown, and I got arrested because I was kind of a bit weird in public. And funny enough, this could be wrong, but I think the first time I admitted there was a problem was when one of those policemen asked me. He just said, very nice, two very nice guys, and he just said, "Look, are you all right?" And I said, "No, I don't think I am." And that was the first time I'd really sort of, because I was hearing voices and all sorts of stuff was going on. And of course, at the time, I was really worried that this was schizophrenia, because of course Donald talked all the time, my brother, he talked all the time about hearing voices and all that stuff. And then I thought, to be absolutely honest, once you're in a police cell banging your head against the wall, and then you're in a hospital with doctors and nurses fussing around you, you kind of know you're not well. But that's the first time it really, really kind of came home to me, because up till then I'd been really high functioning. I was really kind of successful. I was popular. I was good at what I did. And suddenly it's all crashed about me,
But when you come out of hospital, what support was there in the 80s, for somebody that was struggling with their mental health? Because as somebody that grew up in the 80s, my whole perception of mental health was words like nut-ass and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and loony bin, and that was sort of terminology that was commonplace in the early 80s, unfortunately. And so tell me about what was available, and how open was you about what was going on in the 80s?
Well, my breakdown was in the spring of 1986. So I was in hospital for a bit, and then it happened in Scotland. And I flew back to London. I was with Fiona. Thank God she sort of stayed with me, even though I'd moved out because I was I was obviously in a bad way, but I didn't realize I was in a bad way. I was drinking, ridiculous amounts. And I think, so what happened was, when we got back to London, I couldn't face going into London. So I actually phoned a friend of mine who lived down in the West Country, and who lived in the countryside. I said, "Listen, can I come and see you for a bit?" So I stayed down there, and in a way I was looking after myself. Once I was out of the hospital, you say what support was there? I kind of didn't have any. I mean, I had family, my Fiona, friends, but it wasn't for ages that I even went and saw a doctor after I got back.
Why is that?
I don't know. I think because one of the things that in the hospital in Scotland, this very nice guy called Ernest Benny, he was a psychiatrist, sadly died not long ago. But he was the one who, I think, he sort of diagnosed that I had a drink problem by getting me to explain to him how much I'd been drinking. And as I explained to him how much I'd been drinking, I thought, fuck, I hadn't realised. And he didn't say to me, "You should stop drinking." But through the conversations that we had, I thought, God, I've got a real problem, haven't I? And he sort of said, yeah. So I decided to stop drinking. Now, I didn't drink for 13 years.
How hard was that to stop at that point?
I didn't find it that hard, because I had, I think, internalized, with his help, I decided that was my problem.
And if I get rid of that, I get rid of the problem. Happy days.
Exactly. And that's why I thought I didn't need any other help. And then what I realized is that for a long, long time, and I got into this mindset of thinking, I'm fucking brilliant again because I'm stopping drinking. And so I went back to work. Eventually I went back to the mirror. I'd left the mirror, but I went back to the mirror. I started at the bottom again. I was counting the days. Felt my strength rebuilding. when you talk, the other thing about attitudes, the Mirror was a very hard drinking environment. But because I decided I was going to be open, I found it very, very supportive. So I went in and said, look, I went mad, I went crazy, and I had this massive breakdown, but now I'm fine. But just so you know, I've stopped drinking. And people were in the main incredibly supportive. They didn't try and drag me out to the pub. They just didn't. They were just in the main very, very supportive. And that was important. But I think what it meant was that I wasn't ever addressing the stuff that had led me to do the drinking in the first place, which was the depression. So the attitudes in my world were pretty good. And I was, but you know, this is why I always say to people, I think openness is so important. I never regretted being open, ever. And I think that was an incredibly important part of my recovery. But the depressions kept coming, but I didn't really identify them as depressions because I hadn't really related what I was doing when I was drinking to depression. That only came years later.
To move forwards, then, you know, a fair few years to the 90s and the work that you was doing with Tony Blair. I mean, that was as high profile as it can get. And tell me how you would deal with the pressures associated with working at such a high level with such power. Like, how did you sort of cope with that and maintain your mental health in around those times?
Well, I'm not sure I did all the time. When I was transcribing my diaries, after I left, you know, I did this quite a big deal to do my diaries, and so I had to transcribe them. They're all just mad scribbles, and you know, really big mad scribbles.
Have you always kept a diary, Alastair?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. And I think, funny enough, I think that started the kind of sense of, I said earlier, I write every day, and I think the sense of it started, funny enough, you talk about how things were different in the past. When I was about 9, my dad had a very bad accident and he was in hospital for quite a long time. And I used to write to him. I used to write my diary and send it to him every day. And it was just like, really, you know, got up, had breakfast, went to school, we did this, we did that, football, Burnley won, Burnley lost, whatever it might be. And I was sending him match reports and all sorts of stuff. And I think it was that's what sort of, so yeah, I've always written diary. And anyway, when I was transcribing them, it just struck me, God, you were depressed a lot of the time. You know, so many of the days began with woke up feeling shit, woke up, don't feel myself, woke up, pressure high, you know. And I think I think work had become the new addiction. I think alcohol back in the day was probably an addiction. I think I'd always probably been a bit of a workaholic. So I sort of coped with it by doing it, and I don't know is the short answer, because I do sometimes look back and think, quite how I got through all that. I do think it's one of the reasons why I don't want to go back, though. That I know deep down it was a bit touch and go at times.
And you talk about, you know, through those times that it was, you know, you'd start your day by, you know, reading these diaries and that you was feeling shit. And this is, I guess, some of this could have been at the heyday of New Labour and such. And to move forwards to, I guess, when there was a huge backlash, you know, and thrown at the Labour government and the war in Iraq. How did your brain cope with the backlash on that? Because that must have been pretty heavy.
Yeah, it was. I don't know. I think I think internally I do have a very, you know, I'm internally quite strong. I am resilient. I think the other thing is I think I'd already worked out before that I don't want this to sound arrogant because it's not meant to be, but there aren't that many people whose opinion really matters to me. Those people whose opinion does matter to me, it matters a lot. And so I think when it just, and particularly now with social media and the sort of toxicity of abuse that you get, it didn't bother me. Other than this is really difficult. This is, but then I'm doing this job because Tony Blair, who asked me to do this job, rates me to do this job. Most of the people who are working with me and for me rate me as the person doing this job and as the person directing them. Their opinion matters to me. Now, the reason why that period was particularly difficult is because one of the people whose opinion matters to me a lot is Fiona, and she was completely opposed to what we were doing as a government. That was difficult, but in a way, I had to just separate that out. I would just say, well, okay, that's your opinion. I disagree, and anyway, this is my job. So it's probably best we don't talk about it, and you try and separate it out. But that's difficult. So that was difficult. I found it was difficult. We had particularly after the death of David Kelly, the weapons inspector who killed himself in the middle of all this. And the press by then, I mean, the right-wing press in particular, they were absolutely gunning for me. Now, they had been for a while, and it didn't, that didn't bother me because when they were gunning for me in general, it didn't bother me because I knew why they were doing it.
Was it a councillor from Grays that was quite integral in calling out Mr. Kelly? Was it McKinley? Am I right in saying Andrew McKinley?
Oh, the MP. Yeah,
yeah.
That's right. He was an MP.
Yeah.
On the committee that was investigating all this, and he did give him quite a hard time at the committee.
He was.
But I think it'd be unfair to look. You'll have dealt with things like this. I think it's very unfair. I know when he died. Well, look, I was massively in the firing line, but so was Andrew McKinley a bit, because people said, well, maybe that tipped him. I think it's impossible to say that. But yeah, he was. But that day when because what happened, I was in America with Tony Blair. Tony went off. He was doing this big thing at Congress. We saw Bush, and then he did his thing in Congress. And funny enough, we got a message just before I got on the plane. I was coming back to London. Tony was going to Japan, and we got a message just beforehand that Andrew Gilligan, the reporter who sort of set this whole, I know you want to talk about him. He's a lowlife, but he set this whole thing going, and we got this message that one of the committees that was investigating this was coming out with a report making it very, very clear they saw him as utterly untrustworthy, unreliable, etc., which within the context of this never-ending saga was, as it were, good news for once for us. So I get on the plane in Washington, land in London, turn my phone on, dozens of missed calls. I thought, what's that about? And they were like, urgent, phone the switchboard, urgent, phone the duty clerk, etc. And the news was they found David Kelly's body. And that was, without doubt, the worst moment of any. Partly because of the tragedy of it, but also I just knew, I said in my diary, there's a juggernaut coming my way. I could feel a juggernaut coming my way. I got home. I spoke to Tony. He was by now in Japan. I said, Tony, I'm out of here. I just can't do this anymore. I've had enough. And he said, no, you can't go, because if people go, if you go today, people will say the charge they're trying to make, that this is your fault, will say, well, that's you admitting it's your fault, when you know and I know it's not. But it was apart from the death of my parents and my brothers, it was the worst day of my life, bar none. But I don't know where the resilience comes from. And then, of course, from then on, literally from that day until I don't know when the Hutton report came out, you know, and I was cleared, we had media outside the street virtually 24 hours a day.
How does that affect you and you know and your
and Fiona, who didn't want to be a part of it at all? She wasn't in agreement with it.
Day after day, when you know you get into bed and you shut your eyes and you know they're outside and you know that you know there's going to be headlines and they're aimed at you. Like how can you stay on top of that and not crack?
By separating it. So look, I was doing the job I was doing. I knew that. I mean, the irony of the whole thing is Tony and I had already agreed I was going to leave in the next few months. Bizarrely, paradoxically, this thing kept me in longer than I would have been there. But basically, by separating, and I can remember, for example, you just have to make decisions about how you handle yourself. So, for example, if you look back at that period, 2020 years ago now, but I used to think, right, I'm still going to exercise every day. So, but I decided, I'm going to go out. I'm going to go for a run. Now, it meant that for a bit, they chase you for a bit. But while I'm running, I'm not even thinking about them because I've decided to ignore them. So they get lots of shots if you're going out for a run. So what? I made a decision that I wouldn't say a word outside my own house. Not a word. So they can shout all they want. I'm not even hearing it. I'm just in a tunnel and I'm not going out for a run, or I'm getting in the car, whatever it might be. Then I go to work and I'm doing my job. Now, it's a very difficult job to do when you're the spokesman, but suddenly, you know, the media are writing is about you as much as they are about the person that you're the spokesman for. I'm not pretending it's easy, but I think you just have to say, right, the next thing that I do, this is what I have to do. You go in and you do it, and then you carry on. I'm not pretending it's easy, but you just kind of have to do it. And the point about the kids were very supportive. I can remember one day actually I had to stop my boys going out. We had these protesters, as well as the media, we had these protesters outside the house. And I remember going out, you know, the kids wanted to go out and sort of, you know, get involved. And I said, no, don't. I don't know. You just find a way, I guess. I think friends become very important in those periods. But even that, I think you do have to find an inner strength. You have to find an inner strength.
And to move on to more sort of, you know, recent years, like you know, that inner strength you've channeled so much into awareness of mental health. And when did that decision come to sort of, you know, really start shouting about, you know, the need for change in the way that we, you know, society sees mental health?
I don't think there was an exact moment. I think it was a process. I mean, funny enough, the very first thing I did on the kind of public arena space, as it were, was a thing I did for Mind while I was in Number 10. Now, I was very conscious of the fact that even though I got described as all this, you know, all-powerful deputy, the real deputy prime minister, it was all bollocks, right? It really was. Because any power I had was his power, Tony Blair's power. I didn't have independent power. And actually, even doing that, I thought long and hard. I thought, should I be doing this? Because, you know, that's me using the fact that I'm have the job that I have to go out and talk publicly about something. So I decided I'll do it as a one-off and see how it goes. And I did this thing, and it was actually Mind had persuaded the Sunday Times magazine to do a big piece on people in public life who've got mental health issues, right? And I was one of them. Fun enough, the picture, I think it was a photographer called Brian Amos, I think his name was. And it was my mum's favourite picture of me. And bizarrely, which is really odd because it actually had me with one hand over one eye. it was a guy just taking pictures of me while I was sort of talking. And at one point I went like that. But it was a really interesting sort of picture. And funny enough, the other picture my mum loved of me is probably the picture that's been most used of me down the years. And it's of me in Downing Street looking at Tony Blair as he's speaking. And it's during the foot and mouth crisis. And the reason the press use it all the time is because they think it makes me look really evil and manipulative. Right.
Can you do the pose again for us now?
I'll do it now. It goes. You got it?
Very sinister.
Anyway, for some reason, my mum thought it was a great picture. And she really liked it. So it always makes me laugh because the Daily Mail, it's like almost 30 years ago now, this picture, but they still use it as sort of like this is me, right? So what was I talking about?
The stuff that you're doing with mind.
Oh yeah. So anyway, I did it. And then I thought, right, okay, that's enough now. And the other reason was that, you see, I think the big driver of it was my brother. I think that's the real driver of why I wanted to get involved in this campaigning thing, because he had schizophrenia. Look, he had some good treatment, but you know, if he hadn't had his own inner strength, I think his life would have been a lot worse than it was. And so, but my mum, not out of reasons of shame at all, she was incredibly proud of Donald, but she hated me having the profile I had. She couldn't sleep when I was on the news and when I was getting attacked. She couldn't stand it. So I think she worried. So when I said to her, I was thinking about doing stuff and getting involved in this, oh no, please don't do that. It just means they'll write even more horrible stuff about you, and they'll write about Donald. And no, please don't do that. Da, da, da. So I never mentioned Donald. And then when my mum died, because he was really up for it, he really wanted to kind of do stuff. And so we were even talking about making a film together, going on the road together, doing a bit like I did later on the depression thing, but doing one on schizophrenia. And then it's really weird how this stuff happens. What the next sort of big thing was that I ended up writing this novel. I wrote a novel called All in the Mind, which was about a psychiatrist and his relationship with his patients. But there was obviously loads of me in there. There was psychosis, there was drink, there was depression, and when I having written it, I knew there'd be quite a lot of interest in it. And I thought, why don't I do a film as well? So then I made a documentary about depression, not the one that I talked about earlier, a different one, about my breakdown. And it just sort of snowballed from that, really. It wasn't like planned, but it was a very strong impulse. And I think if I really try and analyze it, I think what it was about was saying, I've got this sort of rule of life, get good out of bad. And I think the get good out of bad was actually, if you've had depression, if you've had psychosis, but above all, Donald's had a whole life dealing with schizophrenia, got to try and get something good out of that. So
before you spoke to Mind and started working with them, did you have to get any kind of clearance or permission?
Not really. No, not really. I did, I said to Tony, I'm thinking of doing this thing. Yeah, fine. It wasn't a big deal for him. It was like, yeah, fine, do it. But then I think if he'd felt that I was then going to spend 40% of my time working on mental health campaigning, he said, "Oh, hold on a minute, what are you doing?" But also he knew I wasn't going to do that. No, you'd have to get, and it was, the truth is we had a health minister, we had a mental health minister, what are you doing, kind of thing. But that could have been the reaction, but it wasn't. But once I was out, and then I found it much easier. And then the other thing that happened was that it wasn't just the charities; it was the fact that I found, part of the living that I make is still, public speaking, and corporations want you to talk to them, and big conferences and all that sort of stuff. And I actually found that, some of the big banks, for example, were saying, "We'd like you to come and do a talk, but do you think you could talk about mental health?" you know, oh, yeah,
And this was
okay.
20 years ago.
Not 20 years ago, but, you know, not long after I left.
Mm.
Some of the big financial institutions, and certainly after the crash, because so many of them lost people through suicide, through, you know, whatever. But yeah, you know, quite early on, I was getting people saying, "Could you come and do a talk about mental health?" And that's when I realised something quite interesting is happening here, and you know, this can be big change. And I actually think that, you know, I think, as I said earlier, I think we've gone backwards in the last decade or so with the government. I think at least, you know, David Cameron and Theresa May at least talk the talk on mental health. I mean, since then they don't even talk about it, let alone do anything.
I mean, the first suicide prevention minister was our very own Jackie Doyle Price.
Yeah,
For
yeah,
a couple of years, I think.
yeah. But then if you think about it, if I did this recently, if you Google her, I think you'll find that, and then you press on news, I think the appointment was the most covered thing about that job.
Mm.
Wasn't what was done with it; it was the appointment. And I think likewise. I remember David Cameron. Look, I'm not knocking them. I think they you know, they all tried. But I remember David Cameron. You know, one of his there was something I read where he was listing his achievements, and one of them says, you know, first prime minister to make a speech purely about mental health. Great.
Jesus.
You know, now he did, to be fair to him, he did put a focus on mental health. And Theresa May did, when she stood outside Number 10, she said, when she listed the burning injustices, mental health was one of them. And she did appoint a minister for suicide prevention, right? But what has been achieved as a result of that? That's the question I would have. And, you know, look, had David Cameron lasted, i.e. had he not done his stupid referendum, had Theresa May lasted, i.e. had she not had to deal with the madness of Brexit, then maybe that would have carried on. However, they didn't survive. Boris Johnson came in, and Johnson, Truss and Sunak, I've seen no progress at all.
Sort of start to, we understand we've had quite a lot of your time, Alastair. One thing I want to ask you is, like, obviously you said that we've moved backwards, and obviously we've seen very little from Boris Sunak. What change would you like to see in the coming years?
I think it relates to the change I mentioned earlier about, I think we have to completely change the way that we look at all of it, and move from what we have now, which is a mental illness service, patchy at best, and move to a mental health service, so that we start understanding. I think one of the worst things the coalition did, was the Tories have done, is to get rid of Sure Start, for example. I think that was a mental health policy. Sorry, that's my phone going. I think, you know, that was a mental health. It wasn't about mental. They didn't say this is mental health, but it contributed to positive mental health. I think looking at, you know, one of the things I think we did in government, which I think was a good initiative in education, was the whole thing about classroom assistants. Well, I'd like to get back to that, but where those classroom assistants also have some kind of training in mental health and mental health awareness and understanding and mental health first aid. I'd love to see mental health first aid across the corporate and the business and employment sector become just as well known and understood as first aid is. And then I think, you know, so I'd like to see a lot of stuff done even before we get to the beds, the psychiatric nurses, the doctors, and all the stuff that you need. Because I think actually if we could get that bit right, over the long term, we need less of that. So I think that's what I'd love to see Labour come in and do a sort of, you know, a mental health strategy.
I mean, there are, you know, we are slowly moving in that direction. You've got things like social prescription now, and
yeah,
you know, in terms of, you know, when I'm looking for funding, there's lots and lots of money out there encouraging projects for physical health, obviously knowing that physical health has a massive impact on your mental health. So I think we're going in the right direction, but I think it just needs a bit of acceleration and always more money.
Well, but also the other thing it does need is leadership, and that's why I do think that at the moment you've got the kind of way politics is set up. You've got the Tories been in for 13 years. I think there is a feeling they've got to go, but it's not guaranteed. And then Labour are playing this quite sort of defensive game of not wanting to be, not wanting to upset too many people and not wanting to, so it's quite cautious. And actually, I think this is an area where you can come in with a really big message and say, look, this is not just about money. This is about how we think. This is about what sort of people we are. This is about, so we're going to, I think you could say we'll have a 10-year plan to change from having a mental illness service to having a mental health strategy, and over time we'll save money. Right now, the sort of how you the bits and pieces of how you do that's for the future. But actually, that of itself, I think, will say, and actually, and you do say, like for example with business, some of these banks that I mentioned, right? They've got their own. They're running their own services now. They are looking after, because they've decided, well, the state's not going to do this, so we'll do it. Now, there is a part of me that thinks, well, that's terrible, and that's all part of the Tories kind of running down the health service so as it gets farmed out, etc., etc., etc. But there's another part of me that says that's part of what I said earlier. Let's take ownership of our own mental health. So I think it would be that if there's one thing, if there's only one micro thing, I think it would be the point I made about let's have real, genuine mental health support in schools. That's what I do.
Absolutely. Alastair, thank you so much for giving up your time today to come.
That's all right.
Thank you. It's been an absolute joy.
Hold on a minute. You had glasses on a minute ago. Now they've gone.
Oh, you got the same ones.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Never in the same room at the same time.
No. So how often do you do the podcast?
I'm good. I'll tell you what. We'll carry this conversation on once I've pressed stop. Hang on. Here we go.
Thanks, Alastair.
Thank you.